Hey, great to be with you again. We're going to be on Acts 2, the day of Pentecost today. Uh, Wonderful passage, probably for many of us, one of our favorite passages when God breaks through, and we'll take a look at some of the things it said. I was just thinking about it and thinking, yeah, for the disciples, they didn't know what the day of Pentecost was going to look like. They had some expectation. What had they been told by Jesus that we know about? They'd been told to go and wait in Jerusalem until the power of the Holy Spirit came upon them. They they'd been promised, hadn't they, that they would be baptized in the Spirit. So they knew something that was going to happen, and they knew as well that they would receive power when the Holy Spirit came upon them. They'd been told that as well. But when it actually came to the day of Pentecost, they didn't have a preparation, a list. So this is what's going to happen. This is how you'll recognize that the Holy Spirit has fallen on you in power. They didn't have any of that. So in that sense, though they were praying, they were seeking God, they were gathering together, they were doing all those things. They they didn't know what it was going to look like. And I think when the day of Pentecost came, it came with quite a level of surprise for them. Um, when we look, it says they were all gathered in one place. And I'm going to read a little bit from the Passion translation as we look at this. One of the things I want to encourage us just to have a think about. So often we develop theology that is more to try and explain where we think we're at, rather than a theology that is, rooted in God, properly in God. And an example of this, that people will talk about revival and say, "Well, we won't get revival until we do this, 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 this," and that's not actually true. When you look at the times that God breaks through, yeah, often there are people that have been seeking God. Often there are people that have laid down their lives for revival. But there's people like that across every generation. People that didn't see a move of God. They didn't see something significant happen, but they were still faithful. And I think their reward is incredible in heaven. So we can't develop a theology that says, well, if we don't do this, then we can't expect God to do that, because God is God. And the disciples, what had they done? They gathered together, they'd prayed, they'd waited, they'd been in the right place where they'd been told to be. And then, boom, the day of Pentecost comes. So we're going to enjoy reading some of this and just taking ourselves into it. Imagine you're one of the disciples. It's another day where you're gathering together. This is the day of Pentecost. So maybe there's a little bit more expectation. Is today the day? I'm sure they lived with that, and they probably live with that sense as well, not just is today, but when God comes in power, what would it look like? Maybe they'd even develop their own little theology. When God comes in power, it'll look like this. So it says this in the this translation, the Passion translation. It says, on the day Pentecost was being fulfilled. And I like the sense of this. On the day Pentecost was being totally fulfilled, there was something about the festivals in the Old Testament. They were only a shadow, and the fullness came through Christ. So Pentecost, it was a feast of harvest. It was a harvest time. That there was a fulfillment that this now was a new season of harvest for the gospel, for Jesus. It says all the disciples were gathered in one place. I I like that sense of they were together, waiting, and day in, day out. And it says as they were gathered in one place, suddenly, and again, let's pick up that. One of my prayers is we'll be ready for suddenlies of God, big suddenlies, small suddenlies, whatever they are, and realizing that sometimes we need to make sure in life that we're living with a rhythm of life that we can adjust to a moment when God breaks in, a suddenly of God when it happens. We can be too busy in life to catch hold of those suddenlies of God. Now, I think it's particularly important now when we're the world is slowly opening up, hopefully over the coming months. And I'm noticing it. There's more demand in different ways. There's old demands, there's new demands. And there's choices to be made on how we express our lives. And so, as you set up your life, determine in your heart you'll walk at peace and have room for the suddenlies of God. Suddenly they heard the sound of a violent blast of wind. It's like boom, rushing through the house from out of the heavenly realms. Imagine being in that room. It's like the windows blown open, but they weren't blown open. Yeah, that howl of wind. Last few days here, the wind has been racing across the fields, and there was a protective cover over something that was just rattling in the wind. And you're like, yeah, there's a sound that the wind comes. It says the roar of the wind was so overpowering, it was all anyone could bear. Then it says at once, I like this translation, a pillar of fire that reflects back into the Old Testament, doesn't it? Where Moses led the people out of Egypt. And when he led them out, they were led by a cloud in the day or a fire by night. So it was like the fire was coming to the night here. That there was a declaration of God that light was coming into darkness. The light of Jesus had already come into darkness, but this was another dimension where light was coming on the believers, and believers would be light in darkness. They would be the fire in the darkness. It says the pillar of fire appeared before their eyes. It separated into tongues of fire that engulfed each one of them. I like that better than the normal translation. It says rested. This was an overwhelming experience in the Holy Spirit. If you haven't had an overwhelming experience of the Holy Spirit, you may have been baptized in the Spirit, but why not ask God to open up, even if you have had an overwhelming experience of the Holy Spirit? I was just thinking, it's time for more of that. So let's just pray. Father, I pray for everybody today, everyone joining us here, that they will have a fresh, overwhelming experience of the Holy Spirit. That they'll be overwhelmed, that from that, there'll be a fresh power and life and energy to share and to advance the gospel. It says, so these tongues of fire engulfed them. It says they were all filled and equipped. See, the Holy Spirit comes to enable us, to equip us. So they were equipped with the Holy Spirit and were inspired to speak in tongues, enabled by the Spirit to speak in languages they'd never learned. The Holy Spirit in us and on us is not passive, but he equips us, he enables us. He comes, and there's the fruit of the Spirit, which we can develop in our lives. Then there's the gifts of the Spirit that we can express through our lives. So they were filled and equipped, full of the fruit of the Spirit, equipped in the gifts of the Spirit. And out of that, in that very moment, they didn't have a history of speaking in tongues, but they were inspired to speak in tongues. Must have been an incredible moment as they were looking at each other, speaking in this language they didn't understand, and all of them sounding different. And at that moment, worshippers that had come from all sorts of places, it was one of those times where people had gathered for the day of Pentecost for the celebration. And they heard, people who heard the roaring sound, they came running. It seems to be something of human nature, doesn't it? To run towards something that's unfamiliar. And it says they were stunned over what was happening because each one could hear the disciples speaking in his or her own language. Imagine that. Put it into modern terms. There's English, there's Welsh, there's French, there's German, there's Spanish, there's Italian, there's Russian, there's Romanian. All these languages and many more. That the odd Cornish speaker and Scottish speaker that still knew the language could hear in their own language. That's what was going on in that moment. Many languages spoken and the people could understand, and they're looking, going, but these guys, I'm sure they'd never learned my language. It says they were bewildered, puzzled. This is the best language course out. He says, aren't they, Galileans? One of my little life dreams is that one day I'll be speaking in tongues. I may not understand a word, but someone will come up and say, you're speaking in my own language, the glory of God. There you are. There's a little miracle to pray. So it refers to all the languages there. It says that we hear them speak of God's mighty wonders in our own dialect. It says they were dumbfounded and astonished, saying, what's this phenomenon? But others poke fun at them and saying, they're just drunk on new wine. For us, so to encourage us today, imbibe that story. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. But determine that we're open in our hearts to the suddenlies of God. Determine we're open in our hearts to sudden outpourings of God. And keep our internal eyes attuned to miracles, signs, and wonders, led by the Holy Spirit. Bless you. Have a powerful day in God, and look forward to being with you next time. Okay, bye for now.